Dear Mary, last time I talked to you about the classical era of literature, so this time I thought I'd talk to you about the Romantic era of literature. Despite the usual connotations of the word, it wasn't all about romance. Indeed, there were some romantic elements. For instance, Jane Austen came out of this time.
You have bewitched me, body and soul, and I love you.
That's not what Romanticism was all about. While Greeks were more into telling stories that taught lessons, and they talked about themes of follow the rules and you'll be rewarded, and know your place in society and don't stray from it or bad things will happen to you, you can't escape your fate.
If you had the chance to change your fate, would you?
Blah, blah, blah. Romantics were the opposite. They would not stand for doing things society told them to do. What the movement was really all about was the idea of individual uniqueness, self-expression, liberty, and nature. As time progressed from the 5th century to the 1800s, people began focusing more on the individual and, more importantly, the common individual. If you think about the stories I discussed last time, from classical Greece or Shakespeare's stories, which came before this, which was kind of the midpoint, 1600s. Yeah, that's kind of the midpoint. All the protagonists are noble characters or have some sort of high status, whether they get it by birth, like Hamlet was a prince, or by physical ability, Achilles and Hercules.
Honey, you mean Hercules!
Or spectacular intellect, like Odysseus. The stories are centered around a highly special person. Romanticism brought to light that the common man was just as capable as feeling and struggle as those with high status. This idea of individual uniqueness led to a bunch of libertarian abolitionist movements of the 18th century and early 19th century. For instance, the one that, in a way, kicked off a lot of revolutions, the American Revolution, 1776. People started to think, just because people are born with a silver spoon in their mouth and a funny hat on their head, why does that mean they get to control how they live? Why does a tiny island across the sea regulate the price of tea? The average normal man began to want to be free of convention and tyranny. Most romantics were displeased with the organization of society and used writings and poetry to protest the oppressive ways of the upper class. Nature is a big thing in Romanticism. It's used as an extension of the human emotions, and it has the ability to sympathize with the character. For example, bad weather often coincided with bad moods, rain for sadness, thunder for anger, and if a character is happy, it's sunny outside. Those ideas that we still see in literature and movies today. My favorite piece of romantic literature is Jane Eyre. Charlotte Bronte and her sisters Emily and Anne grew up in the early 1800s. They had 2 older sisters who died young from disease and a brother who withered away due to alcohol and drug abuse. The 3 sisters attempted to start a school in Haworth, England, but they failed to get any students. Emily and Anne both died in the 1840s, leaving Charlotte and their father as the last remnants of the Bronte family. Despite Jane Eyre's refusal to marry a man she did not love, Charlotte eventually conceded to a marriage without love. Shortly after, she died from pneumonia while expecting a child. Charlotte Bronte's most popular novel, Jane Eyre, an autobiography, was published in 1847. The subtitle of the book left readers confused because the book was originally printed under the male pseudonym Currer Bell. All the Bronte sisters wrote under the names of men because women could not be published at the time. Emily wrote Wuthering Heights as Ellis Bell, and Anne wrote Agnes Grey as Acton Bell. Charlotte and her sisters used their own experiences in life to create their works of art in their novels. Jane Eyre is indeed an autobiography of Charlotte Bronte, except Jane had a happier ending than Charlotte did. Some of the parallels include the school that Jane attends and is treated poorly in. It reflects the abuse that Charlotte and her sisters received at Roe Head. Both Jane and Charlotte were surrounded by the death of many girls at their schools due to typhus and poor living conditions. Charlotte struggled with the Victorian social structure and gender relations, and she expressed those feelings in her writings. Many romantic ideals are seen in Jane Eyre. In particular, one scene where Jane thinks that Mr. Rochester is going to marry another woman, and in order to try to avoid her heartbreaking, she decides to leave. And she tells him this, and he asks her why, and he tries to convince her not to leave, and then eventually proposes. Jane Eyre attacks women's social status of the Victorian era. Women were supposed to be very calm, generally, something Jane struggles with because she feels just as men feel.
I have as much soul as you and full as much heart.
When Mr. Rochester, the man she loves, plays with her emotions, she stands up to him saying,
"Do you think that because I am poor, obscure, plain and little, that I am soulless and heartless?"
something Jane could not believe because of all the emotions she held inside herself. She had to repress her feelings because that was what was expected of her. When he tries to convince her not to leave, she says something that would have been revolutionary at this time.
"I am a free human being with an independent will which I now exert to leave you."
Jane craved equality. What she wanted out of her marriage was a true partnership between her and her husband. The way she sees it is we all come into this world naked and alone, and we leave, in a sense, in the same way. And she tells him that. She gives up all pretenses of him being her master, and just speaks to him as herself.
"I'm not speaking to you through mortal flesh. It is my spirit that addresses your spirit, as if we'd passed through the grave and stood at God's feet equal, as we are."
At one point in this scene, Mr. Rochester even says,
I ask you to pass through life at my side. You are my equal and my likeness.
in fact, the way Mr. Rochester has treated her up to this point makes her question his motives when he asks her to marry him.
"Are you mocking me?"
Do you doubt me?
"Entirely."
But Jane doesn't end up marrying him at this point. It has to come later, after he has become crippled and he truly accepts her as an equal and not as something he needs to have the upper hand in. Like other romantics, Bronte used her writing to speak out against these injustices, like the suppression of women. Sincerely, Sophistication.
Your hands are cold.